The wedding was supposed to be the happiest night of her life. Instead, she was sitting alone behind the banquet hall, barefoot, crying so quietly that nobody noticed her tears. Nobody except a man who didn't even know her. And when he sat beside her without asking questions, she looked at him through trembling eyes and whispered the words he would never forget. "You were the only one who noticed." That single sentence would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe that one small act of kindness can give someone a reason to keep going, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You never know who might be watching tonight, while quietly fighting a battle nobody else can see. The wedding reception was taking place at an elegant estate outside Asheville, North Carolina, where hundreds of tiny lights hung from ancient oak trees and white roses covered nearly every table. Music floated through the warm summer evening while guests laughed beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. It was the kind of celebration people photographed, posted, and remembered for years. But behind the ballroom, beyond the kitchens and the decorated garden, there was a narrow stone path leading toward a quiet hillside. That was where Marcus Bennett found her. Marcus had not planned on attending the wedding for very long. He had been invited by his old friend Nathan, the groom, and had promised to stay for dinner before returning to his small apartment in Charlotte the next morning. He wasn't in the mood for celebration anyway. His father had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving Marcus with a grief he rarely talked about. Since then, weddings had become strangely difficult for him. They reminded him of everything his father would never see. Marcus had spent most of the evening standing near the edge of the crowd, holding a glass of sparkling water while everyone else danced. Then, sometime after the first dance, he noticed a woman slip through a side door. At first, he thought she was simply getting some air. But something about the way she walked made him stop. Her shoulders were trembling. A few minutes later, Marcus followed the path and found her sitting on a stone bench beneath a maple tree. Her elegant white dress was gathered around her knees, and one of her shoes lay several feet away in the grass. She was staring toward the distant mountains, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand as though embarrassed that they existed. Marcus almost turned around. He knew what it felt like to want privacy when grief became too heavy. But then he remembered his father. Years ago, after Marcus had lost his first job and felt like a complete failure, his father had found him sitting alone on the porch. He hadn't offered advice. He hadn't told him to be strong. He had simply sat beside him. Sometimes, Marcus realized, people didn't need answers. They needed someone willing to stay. So he walked over and sat at the opposite end of the bench. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask why she was crying. He simply sat there. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The music from the reception was barely audible in the distance, and the warm wind moved through the leaves overhead. Eventually, the woman looked at him. Her eyes were swollen and red, but there was something else in them too: exhaustion. Marcus quietly offered her a clean handkerchief from his jacket pocket. She stared at it for a moment before taking it. Her name was Grace Whitmore. She was the bride's older sister, and she had spent the entire evening pretending to be happy. Grace told Marcus that everyone inside believed she was crying because she was emotional about her sister's wedding. They thought she was overwhelmed by seeing her little sister finally get married. But that wasn't why she was crying. The truth was much harder. For nearly 10 years, Grace had been the person everyone depended on. When their mother became ill, Grace was the one who stayed at the hospital. When her father lost his business, Grace took extra shifts. When her younger sister Abigail went to college, Grace helped pay her tuition. When Abigail got engaged, Grace was the first person she called. And when Abigail had needed someone to help plan the wedding, Grace had been there every step of the way. She had chosen flowers. She had organized invitations. She had helped with the dress. She had even secretly paid for part of the reception after learning that their parents couldn't afford everything. But somewhere along the way, Grace had become invisible. Not intentionally. Not because anyone hated her. She had simply become the dependable one. The one who didn't need anything. The one who was always fine. And tonight, while everyone celebrated Abigail, Grace had suddenly realized that she had spent years helping everyone else build their lives while quietly watching her own disappear. She had recently turned 36. She had no husband, no children, no home she truly loved. Her career had stalled because she had repeatedly sacrificed opportunities for her family. And the man she had been secretly dating for 2 years had ended their relationship 3 weeks earlier. He had told her she was wonderful. He had told her she deserved happiness. Then he had married someone else. Grace had smiled when she heard the news. She had told everyone she was okay. She had even congratulated him. But tonight, surrounded by flowers, music, wedding vows, and happy couples, the walls she had built around herself finally collapsed. She had gone outside because she couldn't breathe. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, she looked ashamed. She told him she felt selfish for being sad at her sister's wedding. Marcus shook his head gently. He reminded her that sadness didn't make her selfish. Sometimes, he said, the strongest people cry because they have been strong for too long. Grace looked down at her hands. She hadn't expected kindness from a stranger. Inside the ballroom, the music changed and applause erupted. Everyone was celebrating. Yet on that quiet hillside, 2 strangers sat beneath a tree, sharing the kind of silence that felt safer than words. Then Grace said something that made Marcus's chest tighten. She told him that earlier that evening, she had stood in front of the bathroom mirror and wondered whether anyone would notice if she simply disappeared from the wedding. Not died, not harmed herself, just disappeared. She wondered whether anyone would ask where she had gone. And that was when Marcus finally understood the depth of her loneliness. He told her that disappearing wasn't the answer. He told her that she deserved to be noticed while she was still standing in the room. Grace began crying again, but this time, she didn't hide her face. Marcus stayed beside her until the tears slowed. They eventually returned to the reception together. Grace's sister Abigail immediately noticed that she was gone and rushed toward her. For the first time that night, Grace didn't smile automatically. She didn't pretend. She told Abigail the truth. She told her that she was happy for her, but she was hurting too. And something unexpected happened. Abigail began crying. She had never realized what Grace had sacrificed for her. She had never known about the tuition payments, the extra work, the wedding expenses, or the opportunities Grace had given up. Abigail hugged her sister so tightly that both women began sobbing in the middle of the reception. Their parents joined them. Then Nathan, the groom, quietly stepped forward. Even the people who had spent the evening dancing began to understand that the wedding wasn't only about celebrating a marriage. It was also about recognizing the people who had helped them reach that moment. Grace had spent years believing that being needed was the same thing as being loved. That night, she discovered they were not the same. She was loved. She had simply been so busy carrying everyone else that she had forgotten to let anyone carry her. Marcus watched from a distance. He didn't expect anything from the moment. He didn't even expect to see Grace again. But as he prepared to leave the reception later that night, he found her standing near the entrance. She approached him with a small smile. She thanked him for sitting beside her. Then she said the sentence that stayed with him long after the wedding ended. "You were the only one who noticed." Marcus told her that he hadn't done anything extraordinary. But Grace disagreed. She said that sometimes noticing someone was extraordinary. A week later, Marcus received a handwritten letter. Grace explained that she had started making changes. She had finally accepted a promotion she had been offered months earlier. She had rented a small apartment of her own instead of continuing to live with her parents. She had started seeing a counselor. She had begun saying no without feeling guilty. And most importantly, she had stopped measuring her worth by how useful she could be to other people. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote that the night at the wedding had taught her something she would never forget. She didn't need someone to rescue her. She needed to remember that she was worth saving. Months passed. Marcus and Grace remained friends. They talked occasionally. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became long walks. Long walks became something neither of them wanted to name too quickly. They both understood that love should never be used as a bandage for loneliness. So they took their time. Grace continued rebuilding her life. Marcus continued healing from the loss of his father. And slowly, 2 people who had met on one of the loneliest nights of their lives began becoming part of each other's happiest days. 1 year after Abigail's wedding, Grace stood beneath the same maple tree. This time, she wasn't crying. Marcus stood beside her. She looked toward the lights of another family gathering happening inside the estate and smiled. She told Marcus that she used to think the wedding had been the night her life fell apart. Now she understood that it had been the night her life finally began. Because that was the night someone noticed. Not her dress. Not her family. Not the sacrifices she had made. Not the role she played. He noticed her. And sometimes that's all a hurting heart needs. Not a grand speech. Not money. Not a perfect solution. Just one person willing to sit beside you and say, without even speaking the words, "You don't have to go through this alone." Marcus looked at Grace and smiled. He told her that perhaps they had both been sitting alone that night. She had been alone because nobody noticed her pain, and he had been alone because he had been carrying his own grief. Maybe, he said, they had found each other because neither of them was meant to stay alone forever. Grace reached for his hand. The lights from the estate shimmered through the trees. Somewhere inside, people were laughing. But for Marcus and Grace, the quiet hillside held something even more beautiful than a wedding celebration. It held proof that kindness doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it looks like a stranger sitting beside you. Sometimes it is simply a handkerchief offered without questions. And sometimes, one small act of noticing can become the first chapter of an entirely new life. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may need this message, and subscribe to the channel. There are people around us every day who are smiling while silently falling apart. You may never know how much your kindness matters. And before we end, I have one special request for you. Comment "Someone noticed me" if you believe no one should ever have to suffer alone. Because you never know. The person sitting quietly beside you today might be fighting the hardest battle of their life. And maybe, just maybe, your decision to notice them could become the moment everything changes.